This isn't a map of a military operation. It's a declassified grid coordinate, circled in red, just 15 miles from the ziggurat of Ur, a place the Sumerians called the gateway to the underworld. And in 2004, a U.S. Army patrol confirmed the ancient. Fear was real. They opened the door, and something was waiting on the other side. The thermometer read 127 degrees Fahrenheit when Sergeant First Class Marcus Valdez's Humvee rolled to a stop in the middle of absolutely nothing. Just sand, heat shimmer, and the distant outline of ancient ruins that had been watching American soldiers patrol this godforsaken stretch of a rocky desert for over a year. "Another day in paradise," muttered Corporal Davis from the gunner's hatch, his voice crackling through the radio. Below him, Private First Class Jenkins, barely 19 and still writing letters to his mom, checked his rifle for the 100th time that morning. The kid was nervous. They all were, but Jenkins wore it on his sleeve like a Purple Heart he hadn't earned yet. This was supposed to be routine. Patrol Grid Lima 77, check for IED emplacements, radio back to forward. Operating Base Basra, same mission they'd run 50 times before. But routine has a way of turning deadly in a place where civilization was already ancient when Rome was just a dream. That Valdez's radio crackled to life. Bravo 27, this is base. New tasking. Ground-penetrating radar picked up an anomaly at Grid Lima 77 Alpha. Investigate and report. An anomaly. In the Army, that word could mean anything from a buried weapons cache to a mass grave. Either way, it meant someone was about to have a very bad day. The coordinates led them to a patch of desert that looked identical to every other patch of desert they'd crossed that morning. Sand. Rocks. More sand. But as they dismounted, Jenkins noticed at first the silence. In Iraq, there's always sound. Wind across the dunes, distant traffic, the ever-present hum of helicopters on patrol. Here, the silence was so complete it made their ears ring. "Sarge," Jenkins whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the dead air. "You feel that?" Valdez did feel it. A wrongness that started in his gut and crawled up his spine like ice water. The ground beneath their boots felt hollow, like they were walking on the roof of something vast and empty. When Davis jumped down from the Humvee, the impact sent a subtle vibration through the sand that seemed to echo longer than it should have. That's when they found the hole. IT wasn't natural. The edges were too clean, too geometric, like someone had taken a massive cookie cutter to the desert floor. And it was recent. No wind erosion, no sand drift filling the corners. Whatever had opened this wound in the earth had done it within the last 24 hours. But the stairs were old, ancient. They descended into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. Each step was carved from a single block of black stone that didn't match anything in the geological surveys of the region. The craftsmanship was flawless, impossibly precise, like they'd been cut with tools that shouldn't have existed when these ruins were young. Jenkins knelt at the edge, his face pale beneath his helmet. "Sarge, this is Sumerian territory, right? All those ziggurats and temples." "Yeah, kid." "What?" "My grandfather was an archaeologist. He always said the Sumerians built their temples on top of older things. Things they were afraid of." Jenkins's voice dropped to a whisper. Things they wanted to keep buried. Valdez's radio squawked to life, making all three soldiers jump. "Bravo 27, what's your status on that anomaly?" "Base, we've got a structure. Looks like a collapsed entrance to some kind of underground complex. Requesting backup and EOD support." The response came back faster than any military communication had a right to. "Negative, Bravo 27. Secure the site and conduct preliminary reconnaissance. This is Priority Alpha." "How copy?" "Priority Alpha." That was the kind of classification reserved for weapons of mass destruction or high-value targets, not archaeological sites in the middle of nowhere. "Copy base. We're going in." As Valdez clipped his radio back to his vest, he caught Davis's eye. 20 years in the Army had taught him to read the signs, and everything about this mission was wrong. The too quick response. The priority classification. The way the brass seemed to know exactly what they'd find before they'd even reported it. Someone had been waiting for this hole to open. Jenkins moved to the stairs first, his rifle light, cutting through the darkness like a surgical laser. But instead of illuminating walls or floors or the end of the staircase, the beams simply stopped, absorbed by darkness so thick it seemed solid. And then, from that impossible black void, something breathed back at them. The exhalation was warm, humid, carrying the smell of wet stone and something else, something organic and ancient and very much alive. It washed over their faces like a greeting or maybe a warning. Jenkins turned back to look at his sergeant, his eyes wide with a terror that hadn't quite found his voice yet. "Sarge, I don't think we're supposed to be here." But orders were orders, and the stairs were waiting, and somewhere in that darkness, something was breathing in perfect rhythm with their hammering hearts. 23 steps down, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. Jenkins counted each one, his breath forming clouds in air that had been blazing desert heat just minutes before. The contrast was impossible. Physics didn't work that way. But physics seemed to be taking a coffee break in whatever hole they'd descended into. The silence was worse down here. Not just quiet. Silence so complete it felt like a living thing pressing against their eardrums. Their radios had gone dead the moment they'd passed the 10th step, cutting them off from the surface world like someone had thrown a switch. Even the ambient static was gone, leaving them in an acoustic void that made their own heartbeats sound like thunder. "Jesus Christ," Davis whispered, and his words seemed to die before they could echo. "What is this place?" They'd reached the bottom of the stairs, and their combined flashlight beams revealed a chamber that defied every archaeological textbook ever written. The walls weren't brick or worked stone. They were smooth, seamless, like they'd been carved from a single massive block of black material that seemed to drink their light. And the inscriptions, Jenkins had studied cuneiform in college, could read basic Sumerian and Akkadian texts. But these symbols hurt to look at. They writhed and shifted in his peripheral vision, geometric patterns that folded in on themselves, in ways that made his brain ache. When he tried to focus on individual characters, they seemed to rearrange themselves, spelling out words and languages that had never been human. "Sarge," he called, his voice smaller than he'd intended. "Come look at this." Carved into the wall, crude but unmistakable, were Latin letters. Fresh compared to the ancient symbols surrounding them, but still centuries old. "HIC dragons. Here, be dragons." "Romans," Jenkins breathed. "Romans were here. They found this place," and he traced the letters with his finger, feeling the gouges in the stone. They'd been carved in haste, probably in the dark. They were warning people. But warning them about what? The chamber opened into a second, larger space that swallowed their flashlight beams completely. They moved forward in a tight formation, boots silent on floors so smooth they seemed to have been polished by millions of years of careful feet. The air smelled of ozone and wet clay, but underneath that was something else, something copper-sweet and organic that made their stomachs turn. And then they found the door. It dominated the center of the chamber, a massive obsidian slab that rose from floor to ceiling. But calling it a door was like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch. This thing was architecture on a scale that dwarfed human understanding, carved with the same impossible geometries that decorated the walls. 7 concentric rings of unknown metal were embedded in its surface, each one inscribed with symbols that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. "It's a seal," Jenkins said, his archaeological training kicking in despite his terror. "Like a vault door, but old. Really old. Pre-flood old." Davis laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Pre-flood? Kid, you've been reading too much Sunday school." But Valdez was studying the rings more closely, and what he saw made his blood run cold. 6 of the 7 rings were perfectly aligned there, symbols forming a continuous pattern that spoke of careful craftsmanship and deliberate design. But the 7th ring, the innermost one, had shifted, just slightly, just enough to break the seal. "Guys," he said quietly, "I think someone opened this thing." That's when Davis made his mistake. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the oppressive weight of the silence, the need to do something, anything, to break the spell this place had cast over them. He reached out with one gloved hand and pressed his palm against the cold, black stone. The response was immediate and impossible. The slab hummed, not with sound, but with vibration that traveled through the ground and up through their bones. The symbols on the rings began to glow with a phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with electricity or chemistry. And from somewhere behind them, from the direction of the stairs they descended, came a sound that made their souls shrivel. That it was the sound of 7 massive rings sliding smoothly, deliberately, into place. The sound of a door closing. Valdez spun around, his rifle raised, but the chamber entrance was gone. Where 23 stone steps had led back to the surface world, there was now only smooth black wall, seamless and impenetrable. Their escape route had been sealed as efficiently as if it had never existed. They were trapped 40 feet underground, in a chamber that predated human civilization, with something that had been locked away for good reasons stirring to life behind a door that was no longer quite closed. And in the growing phosphorescent glow from the rings, they began to see that they weren't alone. The shadows on the walls were moving, not dancing in their flashlight beams, moving independently, with purpose and intelligence. Humanoid shapes with too many joints in all the wrong places, stretching and reaching toward them with appendages that shouldn't exist. Jenkins was the first to scream, but the sound died in the perfect silence of their tomb. And from the other side of the black door, something screamed back, a sound like joy and hunger and homecoming all twisted into one impossible voice. The door was opening, ring by ring, and whatever had been waiting behind it for millennia was finally coming home. The first thing Valdez learned about true terror is that it doesn't make you scream. It makes you forget how to breathe. Their helmet lights began to strobe, clicking on and off in a rhythm that had nothing to do with failing batteries or electrical shorts. In the stuttering illumination, the chamber transformed into a nightmare slideshow. Flash, empty stone walls. Flash, shadows reaching toward them with impossible geometry. Flash, faces in the rock, ancient and hungry and so alien that looking at them made something fundamental break in their minds. Jenkins was pressed against the wall, his rifle forgotten, staring at something only he could see. The faces, he whispered, his voice high and thin. They're all in the walls. Everyone who ever came down here. They're all still here. The strobing lights revealed the truth in fragments. The smooth walls weren't carved stone, they were compacted. Bodies, human forms pressed into the rock like insects in amber, their faces twisted in expressions of ecstatic terror. Romans in corroded armor, medieval knights clutching rusted swords, Ottoman soldiers with curved blades. Century after century of warriors and explorers who had found this place and chosen to stay forever. Davis opened fire. His M4 carbine roared in the impossible silence, muzzle flashes strobing faster than their failing lights. He emptied his magazine in 6 seconds, brass casings ringing against stone as he screamed obscenities at the darkness. But when the bolt locked back on an empty chamber, the silence returned unchanged, and whatever he'd been shooting it was still there, still reaching for them. Valdez's radio crackled to life. Impossible, since they were sealed underground. And suddenly the comms were flooded with panicked transmissions. Base, this is Bravo 27. We are trapped. Repeat, we are trapped in an underground structure. Request immediate extraction. Negative, Bravo 27. Your signal shows you on scheduled patrol. What is your actual status? They're in the walls. Jesus Christ, they're all in the walls. Bravo 27, you are breaking up. Repeat your transmission. But Valdez wasn't speaking. His radio was clipped to his vest, volume down, and his mouth was clamped shut in horror. The voice coming through the speaker was his own, his exact intonation, his speech patterns, his call signs. But he wasn't the one talking. The thing in the darkness was learning their voices. Jenkins had stopped screaming about the faces. He was walking toward the black door now, his movements smooth and purposeful, like a man in a trance. The phosphorescent glow from the rings was brighter now, casting his face in sickly green light that made his eyes look like empty sockets. Jenkins. Valdez lunged for his youngest soldier, but his hands passed through empty air. Jenkins was there, but not there, solid but untouchable, like he existed in a different dimension that only occasionally overlapped with theirs. The radio chatter continued, fragments of their own voices reporting contradictory information. This is Davis. We've found weapons cache at Grid Lima 77 Alpha, multiple RPGs and small arms. Requesting disposal unit. Negative, Bravo 27. Jenkins reports all clear at your location. Return to base. Valdez here. Site is secure. No anomalies detected. We're coming home. But Davis was reloading with shaking hands. and Jenkins was standing before the obsidian door like a pilgrim at a shrine, and Valdez could taste copper and ozone and something that might have been centuries of fear distilled into the very air they breathed. The seventh ring was turning now, rotating slowly in its housing with the sound of metal on stone. As it moved, the phosphorescent symbols aligned with the other 6 rings, and the door, that massive, impossible door, began to open, not outward, like a normal door. Inward, revealing not another chamber, but a void so complete it made the darkness they'd been stumbling through look like broad daylight. It was absence given form, nothingness that had weight and presence and intention. And from that void came laughter, not human laughter. Something that had learned the sound from listening to human voices and had gotten it almost right, but not quite. It was joyful and welcoming and so wrong that it made their teeth ache. Jenkins turned back to look at them one last time, and his face was serene, almost beatific. "It's beautiful," he said, and his voice was his own again. "You can't imagine how beautiful it is on the other side." A gray appendage, not quite an arm, not quite a tentacle, but something that combined the worst aspects of both, emerged from the void and gently, almost lovingly, took Jenkins by the hand. He didn't resist. He smiled as it pulled him forward, into the darkness beyond the door, into whatever space existed on the other side of reality. The last thing Valdez saw was Jenkins's face disappearing into the void, still smiling, still beautiful, still wrong in every way that mattered. The radio crackled one final time with a message that would haunt Valdez for the rest of his life. "At ease, Sergeant." It was his own voice, coming from right behind his ear, spoken by something that wore his words like stolen clothes. But when he spun around, there was nothing there but Davis, white-faced and shaking, and the walls full of ancient faces that had once been soldiers just like them. The door swung shut with a sound like thunder, and the darkness swallowed them whole. Asterisk. Valdez woke up in a hospital bed that smelled of disinfectant and lies. The first thing they told him was that he'd been found wandering in the desert 12 hours after his patrol was scheduled to return. Dehydrated, catatonic, babbling about doors and faces and voices that weren't his own. The kind of combat stress response that turned decorated soldiers into cautionary tales. The second thing they told him was that Jenkins and Davis were dead. "Insurgent ambush," explained Captain Morrison, his company commander, reading from a manila folder that looked too thick for a simple patrol gone wrong. "IED disabled your vehicle. Small arms fire from a prepared position. Your men fought bravely. Sergeant, you have nothing to be ashamed of." But Valdez remembered no explosion, no gunfire, no insurgents, just 23 steps down into darkness, and something that wore his voice like a mask. "Sir, that's not what happened." Captain Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something careful and watchful and not entirely sympathetic. "Trauma affects memory, Sergeant. It's common for survivors to construct false narratives to explain their survival guilt." False narratives. Valdez tested the words, found them bitter on his tongue. "Is that what we're calling it?" The third visitor came that afternoon. No rank insignia, no unit patch, just a quiet man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Mr. Peterson from DoD Logistics. He had kind eyes and a grandfather's smile, but his questions were sharp as surgical steel. "Tell me about the inscriptions, Sergeant." Not, "Tell me about the ambush," or "Describe the enemy positions." Just straight to the inscriptions, like he already knew everything else. What inscriptions? The ones on the walls. The symbols that hurt to look at directly. The Roman warning carved into the stone. Peterson consulted a tablet that definitely wasn't standard government issue. "Hic dragons. Here be dragons." Except it wasn't dragons, was it, Sergeant? Valdez felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I don't know what you're talking about." Peterson smiled, and it was genuinely sympathetic. "Sergeant, I've been reading reports like yours for 30 years. Different locations, different units, but always the same details. The temperature drop, the radio interference, the sealed doors, the voices." He leaned forward. "The disappearances. My men died in an ambush. Your men entered a classified site and encountered something that shouldn't exist. Something we've been monitoring for a very long time." Peterson's voice was patient, like he was explaining simple math to a child. The question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The solution, it turned out, involved Valdez adopting the official narrative. Combat stress, survivor guilt, a heroic last stand against overwhelming odds. That resulted in 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star for courage under fire. A clean story that honored the dead and protected the living. The problem would involve a lot of uncomfortable questions about his mental fitness for duty, his reliability as a witness, and his family's continued access to his military benefits. Think about your daughter, Sergeant, Peterson said gently. She starts college next year, doesn't she? Expensive proposition. Be a shame if something happened. To your GI Bill eligibility. Valdez signed the papers. They transferred him stateside within 24 hours, a compassionate reassignment to a desk job at Fort Bragg, where he could recover from his traumatic experience in peaceful surroundings. No interviews with military investigators. No debriefing sessions with intelligence officers. Just a plane ticket and a strong suggestion that he focus on healing rather than dwelling on the past. His transport lifted off from Taulil Air Base. Valdez pressed his face to the window and looked down at the desert coordinates where his life had changed forever. What he saw made his blood freeze. The site was surrounded by a massive security perimeter. Floodlights on 30-foot poles turned night into day across a square mile of desert. Hazmat-suited figures moved between prefabricated buildings that definitely hadn't been there a week ago. And trucks, dozens of them, were delivering equipment that looked nothing like standard military issue. But it was the convoy leaving the site that made him understand the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. 7 unmarked trailers, each, one sealed and heavily guarded, rolling toward the airfield where a C-130 cargo plane waited with engines running. Whatever they'd pulled out of that hole, it was important enough to require immediate transportation to somewhere with better containment facilities, somewhere that had been preparing for this discovery for a very long time. But his plane banked toward home. Valdez caught a final glimpse of the security perimeter. The floodlights formed a perfect circle around something at the center, something that looked suspiciously like the entrance to a very deep hole, a hole that was still open, still monitored, still active, still breathing. 15 years later, Marcus Valdez sits in a McDonald's parking lot in Fayetteville, North Carolina, speaking into a voice recorder with the resigned tone of a man who's finally decided his life matters less than the truth. His face is obscured by shadow, his voice digitally altered, but his words carry the weight of a decade and a half of sleepless nights. The official story never sat right. Combat stress doesn't explain the satellite imagery. Survivor guilt doesn't account for the budget allocations. And trauma hallucinations definitely don't show up on declassified Air Force reconnaissance photos. That someone leaked to the right person at the right time. They didn't just contain it, Valdez says, his altered voice crackling through cheap electronics. I think they're studying it. And I think it's studying them back. The leaked satellite images tell a story the Pentagon doesn't want told. Grid coordinates Lima 77 Alpha, officially a decommissioned archaeological site, has been under continuous military occupation since 2004. The security perimeter has expanded 3 times. The prefabricated buildings have been replaced by permanent concrete structures that look more like a research facility than a containment site. And the hole is still open. Dr. Sarah Chun, a researcher at the Institute for Anomalous Phenomena, has been tracking these images for 5 years. What she's found challenges every assumption about the nature of the discovery. The heat signatures are wrong, she explains, pointing to thermal imagery captured by commercial satellites. The site maintains a constant temperature 20 degrees below ambient, even in 130-degree desert heat. That's not natural. That's not even possible with conventional cooling systems. But it's the electromagnetic readings that really worry her. Every 6 months, like clockwork, the site generates a massive EM pulse that briefly disrupts communications across a 50-mile radius. The pulses are getting stronger, more frequent, and they're following a pattern that suggests intelligence. Behind the transmission, it's not random, Chin says. It's mathematical. Prime numbers, Fibonacci sequences, patterns that suggest whoever or whatever is down there is trying to communicate. The pattern analysis reveals something even more disturbing. The electromagnetic signatures aren't just coming from the Iraq site. Similar readings have been detected at 7 other locations worldwide, all of them ancient archaeological sites, all of them now under heavy military security, all of them exhibiting the same impossible temperature anomalies and structured electromagnetic pulses. We're not talking about a single incident, Chen continues. We're talking about a network, a system of sites that seem to be communicating with each other across continents. The Sumerian connection runs deeper than anyone initially realized. Dr. James Whitmore, a specialist in ancient Mesopotamian religions, has identified references to the Abzu in texts that predate the flood narratives by thousands of years. But these aren't the sanitized myths found in modern translations. These are older, darker stories about places where the earth opened to reveal chambers that led to the realm of those who sleep but do not dream. The Sumerians weren't just building temples, Whitmore explains. They were building prisons, seals, barriers to keep something locked away until the stars were right for its return. The astronomical alignments are troubling. Every one of the 7 sites lies on a perfect geodetic grid that corresponds to star positions recorded in the oldest human astronomical observations. The sites form a pattern that wouldn't be visible to ancient astronomers unless they were following instructions from something with a much broader perspective on the cosmos. Someone or something planned this network thousands of years ago, Whitmore says, and I don't think it was human. The leaked communications intercepts paint an even more disturbing picture. Radio traffic between the sites, encrypted and classified at levels above top secret, references breeding programs, genetic compatibility studies, and consciousness transfer protocols. The language is clinical, scientific, but the implications are horrifying. Personnel files obtained through carefully orchestrated FOIA requests reveal that the military units assigned to these sites have unusually high rates of psychological discharge, early retirement, and unexplained medical leave. The few veterans willing to speak anonymously describe nightmares, auditory hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense that something is watching them even after they've left active duty. They're not just studying it, one former security officer explains, his voice digitally scrambled. It's studying them, learning, adapting. Whatever's down there, it's getting smarter, and it's getting impatient. The most recent satellite imagery shows new construction at all 7 sites. Not just research facilities, but what appear to be launch platforms. Vertical structures that could accommodate objects leaving the sites at high velocity. The construction timeline suggests a coordinated effort, as if all 7 locations are preparing for the same event, an event scheduled for completion within the next 18 months. Valdez's final words on the recording carry the weight of a man who's seen humanity's future and found it wanting. They opened doors that should have stayed closed. They woke up things that were put to sleep for good reasons. And now those things are getting ready to come home. The recording ends there, but the satellite imagery continues to update every 6 hours, showing a planet-spanning network of ancient horrors preparing for something that will make the Iraq incident look like a training exercise. The gateway was never closed. It was just the first to open. The official record will always say they died in an ambush. But this photo tells a different story. It proves that what went into Site D didn't die. It was changed, recruited. Now, it stands guard over a door that should have never been opened, and declassified geological surveys reveal the true, horrifying scale. This was never just a local incident. It's an infection. A network of perfect, impossible tunnels is spreading from that epicenter, not randomly, but with a chilling purpose. The deepest branch is not heading east into deeper desert, it's moving west, under the foundations of the ancient world that we are told the site is contained, secured, studied. But containment implies a limit. And some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The chamber was never a tomb. It was a waiting room, and the wait is almost over.